The Australian Rebirth, examining the development and identity of Australian cinema in the long 1970s. To begin, I'm going to be giving a background of Australian cinema. In the 1890s, the first films were shown on kinetoscopes. By 1909, Hoyts was founded when Melbourne dentist Dr. Arthur Russell began showing movies on Saturday nights in Melbourne. He soon formed Hoyts Pictures and expanded operations into Sydney by the end of the First World War. Despite multiple changes in ownership, Hoyts would go on to be among the 10 largest cinema chains in the world by 1994. By 1920, the contract system was developed. Under this system, exhibitors were required to block book films from predominantly U.S. distributors 1 year in advance. This practice severely hampered exhibition opportunities for Australian films that were unable to secure a place in the contracts that overwhelmingly favored imported firms. By 1939, the film efforts completely directed towards the war effort. And by 1951, feature film production had nosedived to an average of only 2 films coming out per year. Sydney is an important place in the history of Australian film. The Sydney Film Festival was censored in 1965 and again in 1969. In 1965, David Stratton, the film festival organizer, decided to release a press issue that described the censorship cuts to the films in the program. The move was sparked by scenes forcibly deleted from the Japanese film Woman of the Dunes. And then in 1969, the federal minister for Customs and Excise, John Scott, imposed a ban on the Swedish film I Love, You Love, which had been selected for the Sydney Film Festival. The decision was made just prior to the arrival of director Stig Bjorkman, who had been invited to present his film by David Stratton. Despite extensive media coverage of Bjorkman's visit and hundreds of protesters signing newspaper advertisement, the ban was enforced. When another film was cut by censors at the 1969 festival, organizers inserted a 30-second message saying censored, which attracted boos and jeers from the audience. This all acted as a catalyst for law reformations ultimately passed in 1971. Now, this was a catalyst of the rebirth era during the long 1970s. Censorship tides began to turn. In 1969, Don Chipp was appointed federal minister for Customs and Excise. Regarded as a progressive and a conservative administration, Chipp initiated a series of reforms which culminated revamped classification system and introduction of the R rating in 1971. The Australian Film Development Corporation Bill was introduced into the House of Representatives in March of 1970. It was quickly passed by both houses. It provided funding for many Australian projects and filmmakers with major financial success. The AFTC was later restructured and relaunched as the Australian Film Commission in 1975. Government also created other organizations to stimulate the growth of the industry, such as the Experimental Film and Television Fund. Film schools were also opened, such as the Perth Institute of Film and Television and the Australian Film and Television School, and tax incentives were introduced for film investors, which I'll get into a little later. The identity of the Australian film. The Australian film identity was largely reliant on government support, and some of the earliest films were of a promotional nature to be screened overseas, then of a propagandist nature during wartime. As a result, the conservative Australian pride and values were deep-rooted in the industry. There was an initial burst of masculinist, populist, and iconoclastic comedies referred to as the Ochre comedies during this period for the depiction of Australian male populism. First of these to achieve large-scale success was the cheerfully vulgar movie Stork, assisted by the new R censorship rating, which permitted much stronger depictions of sex and colorful language. Ochre hits of the 70s also include The Adventures of Barry McKenzie, Alvin Purple, and Barry McKenzie Holds His Own. After the early burst of popular Ochre comedies, the film funding bodies restricted their support largely to quality films, aiming at the top end of the market in order to establish the aesthetic rather than the commercial credibility of the Australian industry. Instead of avant-garde or experimental films, they made low-key, visually sumptuous dramatizations of history. The accent on visual style, particularly the exploitation and exoticism of the Australian landscape, was evident as an astute commercial judgment about what might make an Australian film distinctive and attractive to foreign audiences. That's why they hailed Gallipoli, a film narrating a famous Australian battle in World War I as the greatest film ever made, while denouncing The Man from Snowy River as a puffed-up horse opera about love. This ties into the critics holding anti-commercial conservative perspectives during this period. Contrast to American cinema. The producers of Australian films were suspicious of and resistant to the production of genre films, that is, films structured by the narrative codes and conventions of mainstream commercial cinema. With the industry attempting to hit the ground running with the boom of the late 60s and early 70s, there was an understandable preoccupation with selecting stories proven in other narrative media, such as novels and history. Due to the burden of representing national image, any films that wouldn't work well with an Australian accent were abandoned. Excluded genres included cop or spy thrillers, romantic or screwball comedies, westerns, horrors, musicals, and etc. Australians wanted to set themselves apart from American films, but there was also the view that, since the Americans were the primary opposition, any emulation of their films which did not better the originals was bound to damage the Australian film industry. However, by the 1980s, the success of movies like Mad Max, The Man from Snowy River, and Crocodile Dundee lifted the stigmatization of grand, more genre-confining films. They became more acceptable in the 1980s, with films like Mad Max being not only well-received, but also argued that it didn't sacrifice cultural specificity for commercial prospect. The ideological shift described here was paralleled by a dramatic rearrangement of the funding structure of the film industry. The transfer of film funding from state institution to a system of generous tax concessions turned the industry into a commercial rather than cultural project, producing a more varied and lively industry. Thank you very much for listening, and good day, mate.